Tonight, the world stands on the edge of a geopolitical storm unlike anything we've seen in recent years. In a dramatic and high-stakes escalation, US President Donald Trump has issued a chilling 48-hour ultimatum to Iran, sending shockwaves through global markets, military corridors, and diplomatic channels alike. With the Strait of Hormuz under threat and tensions rising by the hour, the question is no longer whether this crisis is serious, but how far it will go. In an unprecedented move that has sent shockwaves across the globe, US President Donald Trump has issued a dramatic 48-hour ultimatum to Iran. Trump's relentless 48-hour ultimatum shakes the world. In an unprecedented move that has sent shockwaves across the globe, US President Donald Trump has issued a dramatic 48-hour ultimatum to Iran. President Donald Trump has issued a dramatic 48-hour ultimatum to Iran, signaling the most aggressive public confrontation of his tenure in the Middle East. The statement, delivered with characteristic bravado and urgency, left international observers stunned and markets reeling, as Trump warned that any failure by Tehran to comply with American demands would trigger a catastrophic military response aimed at crippling Iran's energy infrastructure. The ultimatum is being viewed as both a test of Iran's strategic resolve and a stark reminder of the United States' willingness to escalate tensions in a region already teetering on the edge of conflict. Trump's message came in the form of a forceful statement circulated through multiple media channels, including his personal social media platform and official White House communications. He demanded that Iran immediately reopen the Strait of Hormuz, a vital maritime choke point through which nearly one-fifth of the world's oil supply transits, without threatening the passage of international vessels. The strait, long a symbol of geopolitical tension, has in recent days been effectively restricted by Iranian forces, a move that has heightened fears of a full-scale energy crisis. Trump's language left no room for ambiguity, asserting that the US would target Iran's largest power plants and key infrastructure if compliance was not met within the 48-hour window. Analysts have noted that this is one of the clearest and most aggressive ultimatums delivered publicly by a sitting US president in decades. The timing of the ultimatum is significant. Relations between Washington and Tehran have been deteriorating for months, with repeated skirmishes, sanctions, and retaliatory threats escalating the risk of open conflict. The current standoff over the Strait of Hormuz is particularly sensitive because any disruption to the waterway could have immediate and far-reaching consequences for the global economy. Crude oil futures spiked dramatically following the announcement, reflecting investor fears of a prolonged blockade and the potential for a broader regional confrontation. This spike underscores the high stakes of the 48-hour ultimatum, not just for Iran and the United States, but for the world's energy-dependent economies. Military experts have expressed concern that the deadline itself could act as a catalyst for miscalculation on both sides. The Trump administration has reportedly increased US naval and air deployments in the Persian Gulf, signaling readiness to act swiftly should Iran fail to comply. While the president framed the ultimatum as a decisive step to protect international shipping and uphold US interests, critics argue that it risks pushing Iran into a corner, making a military response more likely than negotiation. The rhetoric used by Trump, emphasizing obliteration of infrastructure and imminent military action, has been interpreted by some as a deliberate pressure tactic aimed at forcing Iran to capitulate quickly. Global reaction to the ultimatum has been swift and pronounced. Key allies of the United States, including members of NATO and Gulf Cooperation Council countries, have issued statements emphasizing the need for de-escalation, but the urgent tone of Trump's deadline has left diplomats scrambling. Many international observers have highlighted that the 48-hour timeframe is unusually brief for any meaningful negotiation or dialogue, heightening fears that the situation could spiral into conflict before diplomatic channels have a chance to intervene. Iran, for its part, has publicly dismissed the ultimatum as unacceptable and provocative, signaling that it is unlikely to yield under pressure. Tehran's response suggests that the next 48 hours could see a dangerous game of brinkmanship, where both sides push the limits of restraint while preparing for possible military engagement. US intelligence sources have reportedly warned that Iran could accelerate military maneuvers and regional alliances as a countermeasure, including bolstering its strategic positions near the Strait of Hormuz. The economic implications of Trump's ultimatum are already manifesting. Oil exporting nations and major markets are recalibrating their forecasts to account for potential disruption, with some energy analysts predicting sustained volatility if the confrontation escalates. Shipping companies have begun rerouting vessels and enhancing security protocols, while insurers are reviewing coverage for transit through the region. The rapid market reaction illustrates just how sensitive global trade is to the standoff, particularly in light of the razor-thin margin of strategic choke points like Hormuz. The psychological and geopolitical impact of the 48-hour deadline cannot be overstated. By framing the situation as a race against time, Trump has effectively turned the standoff into a public spectacle, forcing both Iran and the international community to react under immense pressure. The use of direct, confrontational language has amplified the stakes, creating a tense environment in which any misstep, whether intentional or accidental, could trigger military retaliation. Political commentators are already debating the strategic rationale behind such a compressed ultimatum, questioning whether it is designed to coerce Iran into immediate compliance or to test the limits of international patience and resolve. The 48-hour countdown has now begun, with the world watching as one of the most consequential geopolitical standoffs of the year unfolds. Markets, governments and military analysts alike are bracing for rapid developments, knowing that the window for de-escalation is extraordinarily narrow. The implications for regional security, energy stability, and global diplomacy are profound, as the United States and Iran confront one another with rhetoric and strategy that could redefine the balance of power in the Middle East. Iran strikes back. Tehran's fiery retaliation to Trump's ultimatum. Iran responded with unflinching defiance to what it described as a blatantly aggressive ultimatum from President Donald Trump, signaling that it is prepared to counter any American military action with retaliatory strikes across the region. Tehran's leaders made it clear that the 48-hour deadline imposed by Washington would not bend Iran to foreign demands, emphasizing both the nation's sovereignty and its readiness to defend its strategic assets. The statement, delivered by senior Iranian officials, marked a significant escalation in rhetoric and posture, reinforcing the idea that the confrontation over the Strait of Hormuz could rapidly escalate into direct conflict if either side miscalculates. Iran's reaction was swift and calculated. Senior military commanders announced heightened alert levels across the country's strategic installations, with special focus on naval and missile units capable of responding to threats in the Gulf. Officials underscored that any attack on Iran's energy infrastructure would be met with proportionate retaliation, targeting not only US military assets, but also allied interests in the region. This declaration demonstrates Iran's intent to leverage its strategic position near the Strait of Hormuz as a bargaining tool, while signaling its readiness for a potentially broader confrontation. The Iranian response also included pointed commentary on the 48-hour ultimatum itself. Tehran dismissed the deadline as arbitrary and provocative, noting that no foreign power has the right to dictate the movement of vessels in international waters or the operational autonomy of a sovereign nation. Iranian authorities highlighted that the Strait of Hormuz is a critical conduit for regional commerce, but also a strategic choke point that Tehran can control if necessary, suggesting that any US attempt to forcibly reopen the waterway would encounter substantial resistance. Diplomatic observers have noted that Iran's stance reflects both internal political dynamics and regional strategic calculations. Hardline elements within the Iranian government are likely to view the ultimatum as an opportunity to consolidate power, rally domestic support, and showcase Tehran's defiance against a global superpower. Meanwhile, Iranian military planners appear to be leveraging the situation to demonstrate capability and deterrence, signaling that any aggression against Iran will carry significant costs. The potential for military escalation is compounded by Iran's emphasis on retaliatory options. Analysts have identified several measures Iran could pursue, including missile strikes on US bases in the Gulf, attacks on allied naval vessels, and disruption of energy shipments from other regional producers. While Tehran's statement was firm yet calculated, it is clear that the country is prepared to use both conventional and asymmetric tactics to counter US action, making the next 48 hours an exceptionally volatile period. Iran's messaging to the international community has also been strategic. By publicly challenging Trump's deadline, Tehran seeks to frame the United States as the aggressor, potentially garnering sympathy, or at least neutrality, from other nations concerned about stability in the Gulf. This approach underscores Iran's awareness of global optics and the importance of international perception in any escalation scenario. The economic consequences of Iran's defiance are immediate. Oil markets reacted sharply to the news, reflecting fears of a prolonged blockade of the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping firms and insurers are adjusting operations to account for the heightened risk of regional conflict, and energy-dependent nations are monitoring the situation closely. The interplay of military posturing and economic disruption highlights the complex, high-stakes nature of this confrontation. As the world watches, Iran's defiant posture sets the stage for a tense countdown. The 48-hour window imposed by Trump intersects with Tehran's warnings of retaliation, creating a delicate scenario in which miscommunication, miscalculation, or an unexpected incident could trigger rapid escalation. Military analysts emphasize that both sides are operating under extreme pressure, with little room for error and enormous global consequences should the confrontation intensify. Strait of Hormuz blockade threatens global energy lifeline. The Strait of Hormuz, a narrow but critically strategic waterway, has become the center of an escalating confrontation between the United States and Iran, with global ramifications that could disrupt energy markets for weeks, if not months. Iranian forces have effectively restricted access to the strait in recent days, a move that the Trump administration has condemned as provocative and dangerous. This blockade threatens to halt nearly one-fifth of the world's oil shipments, putting immense pressure on global economies already grappling with inflation and supply chain instability. Analysts warn that even a temporary disruption could trigger a ripple effect across international markets, leading to soaring energy costs, delayed shipments, and heightened geopolitical tension. Tehran has defended its actions, asserting that the movement of vessels in the Strait of Hormuz is a matter of national security and strategic leverage. Iranian officials have emphasized that only ships linked to countries they consider hostile are being restricted, framing the action as a defensive measure rather than an outright threat to global trade. Nevertheless, the international community has reacted with alarm, with shipping companies, insurers, and energy producers scrambling to assess risk and reroute cargo where possible. The blockade is a stark demonstration of the power Iran holds over a choke point that has long been recognized as one of the most sensitive in the world, capable of influencing global oil prices almost instantly. The Trump administration has framed the situation as a direct challenge to U.S. interests and international law. In a forceful statement, President Donald Trump demanded that Iran reopen the strait without threats, issuing a 48-hour ultimatum that included warnings of military action should Tehran fail to comply. The president emphasized the strategic importance of Hormuz not only for energy security, but also for maintaining freedom of navigation in international waters, framing the blockade as an unacceptable escalation that threatens global stability. U.S. naval forces have been repositioned to the Gulf, signaling readiness to intervene if necessary, while diplomatic channels remain tense and constrained by the short time frame of the ultimatum. The economic impact of the blockade is already visible in financial markets. Crude oil prices have surged past $100 per barrel as traders react to the uncertainty surrounding the strait's accessibility. Energy analysts warn that prolonged disruption could strain reserves, increase production costs, and force nations to seek alternative suppliers or routes, potentially exacerbating the already fragile global supply chain. Beyond oil, other commodities that rely on maritime shipping through the region, such as liquefied natural gas and refined petroleum products, could also experience delays and price volatility. Regional stakeholders are closely monitoring the situation, with Gulf Cooperation Council nations expressing concern over the potential for broader conflict. Military experts emphasize that the strait's blockage is a strategic maneuver that allows Iran to project power without immediately resorting to open combat. But the high stakes make miscalculation extremely dangerous. Any misstep by either side could escalate the blockade into a direct confrontation, with consequences that extend far beyond the Persian Gulf. Oil prices surge past $100 amid Middle East tensions. Global oil markets have reacted sharply to the escalating confrontation between the United States and Iran, with prices surging past the $100 per barrel mark as traders grapple with the implications of restricted access to the Strait of Hormuz. The spike reflects both immediate fears of disrupted shipments and broader concerns over regional stability, as the 48-hour ultimatum issued by President Donald Trump has intensified the perception of an imminent crisis. Analysts warn that the rise in crude prices could have cascading effects on consumer energy costs, industrial production, and economic growth worldwide, particularly in countries heavily reliant on imported oil. The surge comes after Iranian forces effectively restricted access to the strait, a key transit route for global oil supply. With nearly one-fifth of the world's crude passing through Hormuz, even a short-term disruption has the potential to destabilize markets. Energy traders have responded to the heightened risk with a rapid increase in futures contracts, pushing benchmark prices to levels not seen in recent months. The volatility underscores the critical importance of the strait and illustrates how geopolitical flashpoints can immediately affect global supply chains. U.S. officials have attributed the disruption directly to Tehran's strategic maneuvers, framing it as an act of coercion aimed at testing American resolve. President Trump's 48-hour deadline for reopening the strait has added urgency to the market response, as investors weigh the possibility of military action against the potential for diplomatic resolution. Commodity analysts note that uncertainty, even more than immediate supply constraints, often drives market behavior in such high-stakes situations, amplifying price swings as traders hedge against worst-case scenarios. The implications extend beyond crude oil, as refined petroleum products, liquefied natural gas, and petrochemical shipments all rely heavily on secure passage through the Strait of Hormuz. Shipping companies have begun reviewing risk assessments, and insurance premiums are reportedly rising in response to the perceived threat of conflict. The ripple effect is likely to be felt in downstream industries, from manufacturing to transportation, highlighting the broader economic consequences of Middle East instability. Economic observers have also highlighted the psychological impact of such a spike. High-profile geopolitical tensions combined with soaring energy costs can undermine consumer confidence, affect investment decisions, and place additional pressure on central banks already dealing with inflationary pressures. Policymakers in oil-importing nations are closely monitoring the situation, considering both strategic reserves and alternative supply channels in anticipation of a prolonged disruption. The combination of Iran's blockade tactics, Trump's ultimatum, and the resultant market response has created a tense environment where energy security and geopolitical strategy intersect. Experts warn that any escalation could push oil prices even higher, while even a brief resolution may not immediately calm markets due to lingering uncertainty about the region's stability and future access to the vital Strait. U.S. forces on high alert amid Gulf escalation. U.S. military forces have entered a heightened state of readiness in the Persian Gulf following President Donald Trump's 48-hour ultimatum to Iran, signaling an unprecedented level of alert as tensions between the two nations reach new heights. Naval and air units have been repositioned strategically across the region, including additional aircraft carriers, destroyers, and surveillance aircraft, while specialized rapid response units have been placed on standby to act immediately if Iran fails to comply with the U.S. demand to reopen the Strait of Hormuz without threats. Military officials describe the move as a defensive posture intended to protect American interests and shipping lanes, but the deployment also carries an unmistakable message of deterrence. Commanders in the region are reportedly conducting intensive exercises to ensure coordination between naval, air, and ground forces, with a focus on rapid strike capability. The Trump administration has emphasized that these deployments are precautionary but unavoidable given the narrow 48-hour deadline. Intelligence agencies are closely monitoring Iranian naval movements, missile tests, and regional alliances, assessing potential targets and contingency plans to respond to any provocations. The increased military presence has not gone unnoticed by Iran, which appears to be adjusting its own operations in response, raising the risk of miscalculation or accidental confrontation in the heavily trafficked waters of the Gulf. Analysts note that U.S. forces are operating under extraordinary pressure, balancing the need to demonstrate strength while avoiding actions that could inadvertently escalate into open conflict. Commanders are reportedly reviewing rules of engagement and contingency protocols to prepare for scenarios ranging from limited strikes to full-scale retaliation, a situation described by military observers as tense and highly volatile. The presence of international naval forces in the region adds another layer of complexity, as any engagement could draw multiple nations into the conflict, amplifying the geopolitical stakes. The heightened alert has already had immediate operational and logistical consequences. Naval convoys and commercial shipping have been advised to exercise caution, while the US President Donald Trump has issued a dramatic 48-hour ultimatum. Military has ramped up communications with allied forces to ensure coordination in case of emergency. Air defense systems in the region have been placed on maximum readiness, and intelligence sharing mechanisms with regional partners have been intensified. While these measures are intended to prevent escalation, military experts warn that even minor incidents, miscommunication, or misfires could trigger a broader confrontation. The psychological impact of the alert is also significant. US forces, operating under intense international scrutiny, are acutely aware that every move is being watched not just by Iran, but by allies, rivals, and global markets. Analysts suggest that the show of force is designed as much to reassure allies and energy markets as it is to warn Iran, underscoring the delicate balance of signaling strength without provoking a preemptive strike. Global leaders urge diplomacy as tensions skyrocket. In the wake of President Donald Trump's 48-hour ultimatum and Iran's defiant response, global leaders are calling urgently for diplomacy to prevent the crisis from spiraling into a full-scale conflict. The situation in the Strait of Hormuz has triggered international concern, with countries from Europe, Asia, and the Middle East emphasizing the need for measured dialogue over military action. The calls highlight the recognition that the stakes extend far beyond regional disputes, encompassing global energy security, international trade, and geopolitical stability. Diplomatic channels are reportedly active behind the scenes, though the short time frame imposed by the US ultimatum complicates efforts to negotiate a peaceful resolution. United Nations officials and senior foreign ministers from major powers have urged restraint on both sides, warning that any escalation could have catastrophic consequences for the global economy and the safety of commercial shipping in the Gulf. The messages underscore a consensus that open conflict between two nuclear-capable states in a critical region would be disastrous. Allies of the United States have expressed cautious support, acknowledging the strategic importance of ensuring free passage through the Strait of Hormuz, while simultaneously advocating for dialogue to avoid miscalculation. European powers, in particular, have stressed the importance of multi-party engagement, calling for urgent talks involving the US, Iran, and neutral intermediaries to de-escalate tensions before the 48-hour deadline expires. Meanwhile, regional nations are reportedly coordinating contingency plans to secure critical infrastructure, protect energy shipments, and prevent accidental escalation from localized incidents. Analysts note that the diplomatic pressure comes at a time when markets and militaries are already reacting to heightened uncertainty. International organizations are urging all parties to recognize that economic, humanitarian, and strategic costs could escalate rapidly. Diplomatic advisors suggest that back-channel negotiations may be more effective than public pronouncements, given that the rhetoric surrounding the ultimatum and Iran's retaliation has created an atmosphere of heightened tension. The calls for diplomacy reflect not only concern over the immediate standoff but also broader apprehension about the potential for wider regional destabilization. Experts warn that any military action in or near the Strait of Hormuz could draw neighboring nations into conflict, disrupt global trade routes, and exacerbate already fragile energy markets. International leaders are reportedly exploring ways to mediate, offering incentives for compliance, security guarantees, or third-party monitoring mechanisms to prevent unintended escalation. Iran targets hostile vessels to assert strategic leverage. Iran has escalated its control over the Strait of Hormuz, targeting vessels linked to nations it considers hostile, signaling a deliberate effort to assert strategic leverage against the United States and its allies. Tehran's military warned that any attempt to challenge its authority or navigate the waters without permission could face interception, while emphasizing that commercial ships from neutral countries would not be impeded. Analysts note that this tactic amplifies Tehran's bargaining power while heightening global concern, as the restriction of even a few key tankers can trigger massive disruptions in oil markets. The move also reflects Iran's broader strategy of deterrence, demonstrating capability without immediately provoking full-scale military engagement. But the calculated risk carries the potential for unintended escalation in one of the world's most sensitive maritime choke points. Cyber threats loom over energy infrastructure amid escalation. Amid the growing confrontation between the United States and Iran, cybersecurity experts are warning of heightened risks to critical energy infrastructure across the Gulf. Tehran has reportedly signaled readiness to employ asymmetric cyber tactics as a countermeasure to US threats, potentially targeting power grids, oil terminals, and communication networks. Analysts caution that cyber attacks could amplify the impact of any physical blockade, disrupting oil exports, refining operations, and even international financial transactions linked to energy supply. Governments and private operators are reportedly reinforcing defenses, conducting drills, and increasing monitoring, but the risk of miscalculation or a covert cyberstrike remains high, adding a digital dimension to a crisis already dominated by military posturing and geopolitical tension. Regional allies brace for impact amid rising Gulf tensions. Gulf nations are urgently preparing for potential fallout from the escalating US-Iran confrontation, reinforcing military positions, securing energy infrastructure, and coordinating contingency plans to protect shipping lanes and oil exports. Regional leaders have emphasized vigilance, warning that even minor incidents could trigger broader conflict, while working behind the scenes with international partners to prevent escalation. Analysts note that heightened readiness in countries bordering the Persian Gulf underscores the precarious nature of the crisis, as every naval maneuver, missile test, and deployment is closely monitored, reflecting the delicate balance between deterrence and provocation in one of the world's most strategically sensitive regions. Countdown to confrontation. 48-hour window fuels global anxiety. As the 48-hour deadline imposed by President Trump ticks down, global anxiety is mounting over the possibility of direct confrontation between the United States and Iran. Governments, energy markets, and military observers are closely monitoring developments in the Strait of Hormuz, where every maneuver by Tehran or Washington is scrutinized for signs of escalation. Analysts warn that the compressed timeframe increases the risk of miscalculation, with the potential for sudden military action, economic disruption, or a broader regional conflict. Diplomats are reportedly engaged in urgent back-channel communications to prevent the crisis from spiraling, but the ticking clock has intensified pressure on all parties involved, creating a tense atmosphere of uncertainty and high stakes. As this crisis unfolds, every second of the 48-hour countdown has carried immense weight, shaping a volatile landscape where military power, economic stability, and global diplomacy collide. From the strategic chokehold over the Strait of Hormuz to the surge in oil prices shaking international markets, the stakes have extended far beyond Washington and Tehran, reaching into every corner of the global economy. The heightened alert of US forces, combined with Iran's calculated defiance and readiness to retaliate, has created a scenario where even the smallest miscalculation could trigger consequences on a massive scale. Regional allies have braced for impact, reinforcing defenses and preparing for a conflict that could spread rapidly across borders, while cyber threats have introduced a new and unpredictable dimension to the crisis. At the same time, world leaders have raced against the clock to contain the situation through diplomacy, aware that the cost of failure would not only be measured in military terms, but in economic disruption, energy insecurity, and geopolitical instability. The tension surrounding targeted vessels, restricted waterways, and military deployments has turned the Strait of Hormuz into the focal point of a global standoff. This unfolding situation is not just a regional dispute, it is a defining moment that tests the balance between power and restraint, strategy and consequence, urgency and caution. Every development within this narrow window has carried the potential to reshape alliances, redefine security priorities, and alter the trajectory of international relations. As the 48-hour deadline imposed by President Trump ticks down, global anxiety is mounting over the possibility of direct confrontation between the United States and Iran.